The Christmas lights were still up in February. That was the first thing I noticed when I pulled into the driveway of my aunt's house, my Aunt Sandra's house, 3 days after her funeral. Tiny white bulbs strung along the eaves, blinking slowly in the cold Alberta air, like nothing had changed. Like she might still come to the door in her housecoat with a mug of tea and ask why I hadn't called first. I sat in my car for a long moment, with the engine running and my hands still on the wheel. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried since the hospital, and even then, it had only been for a few minutes in the parking garage where nobody could see me. Crying felt like something I couldn't afford right now. There was too much to do, and I was the only one doing it. My name is Paige Holloway. I'm 26 years old. I'm a registered nurse at a hospital in Edmonton. I share a one-bedroom apartment with a cat named Biscuit, and 3 weeks ago I became the only person in my immediate family who seemed to understand that when someone dies, the world doesn't pause to let you grieve. Someone has to make the phone calls. Someone has to notify the bank, cancel the subscriptions, call the funeral home, choose between the mahogany and the pine. That someone was me. My Aunt Sandra never had children of her own. She'd been married briefly in her early 30s to a man named Gerald, who moved to Vancouver and was never spoken of again. After that, she'd lived alone in the same two-story house and street, Albert, for over 20 years, gardening in the summer, painting watercolors in the winter, and driving 40 minutes to visit me on my birthdays even after I moved out of my parents' place. She was my mother's older sister. She was the person who taught me to parallel park, who brought me soup when I had my tonsils out at 19, who sat beside me in the waiting room when I got the results of a test I'd been terrified to take. She never asked questions I wasn't ready to answer, and she never made me feel small for needing her. She died of pancreatic cancer on a Tuesday morning in January. She was 61 years old. I'd known about the diagnosis for 8 months. Sandra had called me herself, not my mother, not my Uncle Ron, me, and asked me to meet her for coffee at the little bakery near her house. She ordered a cinnamon bun she barely touched and told me in a steady voice that the prognosis wasn't good and she had some things she wanted to get in order. "I'm not asking you to be sad with me right now," she'd said. "I'm asking you to help me be organized." That was Sandra, practical until the end. I went with her to 3 different appointments over the following months. I helped her contact a lawyer. I drove her to her treatments when she was too tired to drive herself, and I sat in the waiting room, reading the same 3 magazines over and over because she didn't want me in the room while the IV was in her arm. She said it made her feel like a patient. "You are a patient," I told her. "I know," she said. "I just don't want to look like one." My mother, Cheryl, visited Sandra 4 times during those 8 months. I know because I counted. She lives 40 minutes away. She has a car. She is retired. My Uncle Ron, Sandra's younger brother, lives in Calgary. He made the drive up once in August and spent most of the visit talking about traffic on the QE2. I am not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because it matters later. When Sandra passed, I was the one who sat with her. The nurses on shift knew me by name because I'd been coming in almost every evening for the last 2 weeks. The doctor pulled me aside in the hallway afterward and thanked me for being there, and I had to explain that I was just her niece, not her daughter. And he looked momentarily confused, like that category of person shouldn't have been there that consistently. I went home, fed Biscuit, showered, and then sat on my bathroom floor for a while. Then I started making the calls. My mother cried on the phone. That was appropriate. What was less appropriate was what she said after. "You'll handle the arrangements, won't you? You're so good at that kind of thing." I told her yes. I am apparently very good at that kind of thing. The funeral was held the following Saturday. It was small, Sandra had wanted small, and the people who came were mostly her friends, from the garden club and a few neighbors, and a woman named Diane who'd worked with her at the school board years ago. My mother wore a black coat I'd never seen before, and cried tastefully into a folded tissue. Uncle Ron shook hands with people he didn't know and kept checking his phone. I gave the eulogy because Sandra had asked me to. I had written it the night before, sitting at my kitchen table with Biscuit on my lap and a glass of wine I didn't drink. I talked about the cinnamon buns and the parallel parking and the waiting room magazines. I talked about the way she said my name, like it was something she was glad existed. I held it together until the last line. Afterward, at the small reception at the church hall, Uncle Ron pulled me aside near the coffee urn. He had a plate of squares in one hand and what I can only describe as a businessman's expression on his face. "We should talk about the house," he said. I looked at him. "Today?" "No, no soon. Just, there's the matter of the estate." "There's a lawyer," I said. "Sandra set everything up. The lawyer will be in touch." He nodded, but the expression didn't leave his face. I didn't think much of it in the moment. There was too much else to carry. Over the next 2 weeks, I handled the practical dismantling of my aunt's life. I canceled her utilities and notified Service Canada, and called the insurance company, and arranged for a neighbor to take her car temporarily. I went through her mail. I watered the plants she'd left behind, 7 of them, all labeled in her handwriting with little paper tags because throwing them out felt wrong. My mother came by the house once to help. She walked through each room slowly, occasionally picking up objects and setting them down again, and at one point she said, "Sandra had such nice things," in a tone that I couldn't quite read. The lawyer, a quiet man named Mr. Abernethy, had contacted me the week after Sandra passed. He told me there was a will, and that he'd like to schedule a meeting to review its contents. I told him I'd be there. He mentioned that Sandra had left specific instructions, and that she'd been very thorough. "She was always thorough," I said. "Yes," he said, "she was." The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. I took the morning off work. The Sunday before that Thursday, my family held what my mother called a small dinner to be together. This was not unusual. My mother has always dealt with grief by feeding people. She made a roast and Yorkshire pudding, and my Uncle Ron drove up from Calgary with his girlfriend, a woman named Patrice, who is approximately my age and works in real estate. I brought a bottle of wine. Everything was fine, until it wasn't. We were at the table, somewhere between the main course and dessert, when Uncle Ron refilled his glass, his third or fourth. I'd stopped counting and looked down the table at me with an expression I can only describe as performatively casual. "So, Paige," he said, "you were close with Sandra." "Yes," I said. "Spent a lot of time over there." "Yes. More than any of us, really." He said it like it was a neutral observation. Like it was a fact about the weather. "Someone had to," I said, and I meant it to sound lighter than it did. Ron set his fork down. "You know she always had a soft spot for you. Even when you were little. Used to say you were the daughter she never had." He paused. "I always thought that was a bit much, honestly. You're not her daughter. We're her family. Her real family." I looked at him. "Ron," my mother said, quietly. "I'm just saying," he continued. "Sandra was sentimental. She made decisions based on emotion, and sometimes people take advantage of that, maybe without even meaning to." The table was very quiet. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting," I said. My voice was steady. I was surprised by that. "I'm not suggesting anything," he smiled. "I just think it's worth having an open conversation about what Sandra would have actually wanted, for the house, specifically. I mean, we're her family. You're her niece. It would make sense for the property to stay in the immediate family." Patrice, beside him, was studying her plate very carefully. "There's a will," I said. "And a lawyer. We'll all find out on Thursday." "Of course." He picked his fork back up. "I'm just saying it's worth thinking about." My mother said nothing. She passed the gravy boat to no one in particular. I drove home that night with the windows down, despite the cold. I needed the air. I kept running the conversation back through my head, trying to locate the exact moment it had shifted from a family dinner to something else. I couldn't find it. It had happened slowly, the way some things do. I thought about Sandra saying, "I'm not asking you to be sad with me. I'm asking you to help me be organized." I thought about the 7 labeled plants. I thought about 4 visits in 8 months. Thursday came. Mr. Abernethy's office was quiet and smelled like old paper and carpet. He had a box of tissues on the corner of his desk that I suspect he kept there specifically for occasions like this. My mother and Uncle Ron were already seated when I arrived. Patrice was in the waiting room. I didn't ask why she'd come. Mr. Abernethy reviewed the will in a careful, methodical way. He was the kind of man who did not skip steps, which I respected. Sandra had left her garden club memberships and watercolor supplies to Diane, the woman who had come to the funeral. She'd left a specific piece of jewelry to my mother, a pearl bracelet their own mother had given her decades ago. She left the house, the property, and the majority of her estate to me. Ron made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Mr. Abernethy continued reading. There were no ambiguities. Sandra had been, as he had noted, very thorough. This is Ron started. Mr. Holloway, Abernethy said, with a patience that suggested he had done this before. The document is legally sound. Miss McAllister had full capacity at the time of signing. If you have questions, I'm happy to address them. When was it signed? Ron asked. Abernethy told him. It had been signed 14 months ago, before the diagnosis, before the treatments, before any of it. Sandra had made this decision when she was healthy and clear-headed, and had simply kept it updated as the months went on. Ron looked at me. I looked back at him. She had capacity, I said. She was organized. She always was. My mother hadn't said anything. She was holding the small velvet box with the pearl bracelet in both hands, very still. Ron left without finishing his coffee. Patrice followed him out. I heard his voice in the hallway, lower, controlled, but with an edge in it that I recognized from Sunday dinner. My mother lingered. After Abernethy stepped out to give us a moment, she turned to me and said, I didn't know. I know you didn't, I said. She never told me. No. I paused. She didn't tell me either. Not exactly. My mother looked at the bracelet box. I should have visited more. It was the most honest thing she'd said in weeks. I didn't answer it because there wasn't an answer that would help either of us. I went to the house that afternoon. It was a Thursday in February, and the light came through Sandra's kitchen window at a low angle, the way winter light does, turning everything slightly gold. I stood in the kitchen for a long time without taking off my coat. The plants were still on the windowsill. I had watered them 2 days ago. There was an envelope on the kitchen table. Mr. Abernethy had mentioned it, said Sandra had left it separately, outside the official documents, with my name on it. He'd placed it in a folder and given it to me after my mother left. I'd carried it in my bag for the drive over, and now I set it on the table and stood looking at it. It was a regular white envelope. My name was written on the front in Sandra's handwriting, that particular handwriting, looped and precise, that I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists and the little paper tags on the plants. I sat down and opened it. I'm not going to share everything she wrote. Some of it is mine. But I'll tell you what she said at the beginning, because it matters. She wrote, I know you'll be the one who shows up. You always have been. That's not a burden I'm putting on you, it's a truth I'm acknowledging. Some people show up, and some people don't. And you have always been someone who shows up. I want you to have a place that shows up for you in return. She wrote about the house, about the garden she'd planted over 22 years, the rose bushes along the back fence, the section near the shed she'd always meant to do something with and never did. She said I could do whatever I wanted with it. She said she hoped I'd keep at least one rose bush. She wrote that she knew Ron would have feelings about the will. She said she'd made her decision clearly and legally, and she was sorry if it made things complicated, but she was not sorry for making it. She wrote, the people who are there in the hard moments have already earned what they're given. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. At the very end, she wrote, water the plants, especially the fern. It's dramatic, but it's worth it. I laughed at that. It surprised me, the laugh coming up sudden and real, and then I put my arms on the table and I finally cried. Not the parking garage kind, the real kind, the kind that takes a while. When I was done, I washed my face at Sandra's kitchen sink and stood at the window looking out at the back garden. There was snow on everything. The rose bushes were bare, just dark branches above the white, but they were still there, still rooted. Ron called me 4 times over the following 2 weeks. I let the calls go to voicemail. In the messages, his tone shifted from reasonable to wounded to something colder that he tried to keep out of his voice, but couldn't quite manage. He talked about fairness. He talked about family. He talked, in the last message, about consulting someone. I called Mr. Abernethy, who told me calmly that the will was iron. Sandra had been precise. There was nothing to consult about. I called Ron back after that. I kept my voice even. I told him I understood he was upset. I told him I hadn't known the extent of Sandra's plans, and that whether or not he believed that was up to him. I told him that Sandra had made her decision legally and thoughtfully, and that I intended to honor what she'd wanted. She was lonely, he said. You made yourself indispensable to a lonely woman. I let the silence sit for a moment. She was sick, I said. And she wasn't alone because I chose to be there. She wasn't alone because of me. I can't say the same about anyone else. He hung up. I stood in my apartment with the phone in my hand and biscuit winding around my ankles, and I thought about what it means to be present for someone. Not just at the easy moments, the dinners and the holidays and the times when showing up costs you nothing, but at the appointments and the waiting rooms and the Tuesday mornings when the news is bad and someone needs another person in the chair beside them. I thought about the Christmas lights still blinking on the eaves when I pulled into the driveway after the funeral, how they'd looked like a signal, like the house waiting. In March, I began the process of making decisions about the property. I took my time. I didn't rush. I went to the house on a Saturday when the temperature had finally lifted above zero and stood in the back garden for a long time. The rose bushes were starting to show the first faint signs of buds, tiny, hard, barely there, but present. I kept all 7 of them. I took the paper tags Sandra had put on the potted plants and kept those too, in a small wooden box I found in her study. Her handwriting on paper, preserved. It seemed important. I moved the fern to a south-facing window. My mother called in April. Not about the house, not about Ron, not about anything practical. She called to ask how I was doing. It was the first time in a long time she'd called to ask that specifically. I'm okay, I said. I'm figuring it out. She chose well, my mother said, after a pause. Sandra. She always knew people. It wasn't an apology. I don't think my mother is built for direct apologies. But it was something, and I received it as something. Ron and I have not spoken since the phone call. I don't know if we will. I'm not holding the door closed, but I'm not holding it open either. That's his choice to make. What I know is this. The house is in Street Albert, on a quiet street with old trees and neighbors who wave from their driveways. The kitchen window faces east, and in the morning the light comes in low and gold. There's a fern on the south windowsill that is, as Sandra promised, dramatic, but worth it. There are rose bushes in the back garden that are going to bloom in June, and I intend to be there when they do. My name is on the deed. I am 26 years old, and I am someone who shows up. That turns out to matter more than I knew. There is something that no one tells you when you're young about the relationships that will define your life. We talk about family like it's geography, like proximity at birth determines depth of connection, like blood automatically means presence. But the people who sit with you in waiting rooms, who write your name on envelopes to be opened after they're gone, who label their plants so you'll know how to care for them, those people are building something. They are making a choice. Every time. To show up. And the people who are shown up for carry that. It lives in them. It makes them more capable of showing up for others in turn. Presence is not a small thing. It is, in many ways, the only thing. Sandra understood that. I'm still learning it, but I have a house with east-facing windows and 7 plants and a garden full of rose bushes, and every morning when the light comes in, I think I understand it a little more. Don't wait to be present for the people who matter to you. Don't let the drive feel too long, or the timing feel inconvenient, or the situation feel too hard. The moments you show up in are the ones you'll be remembered for, and more than that, they're the ones that will shape who you become. The fern is fine, by the way. Dramatic, as advertised, but absolutely worth it.